Good afternoon, everybody, and welcome back to Abraham Lincoln Bookshop. My name is Bjorn Skaptason, and we are back today with a very exciting event on A House Divided. A House Divided is our live stream book signing, book discussion event. And we have been doing it, ever since Doris Kearns Goodwin wrote Team of Rivals. And not enough of you had computers and live streaming to see that one, but we did it just the same. Welcome back. And today is a very exciting event. Today, H.W. Brands is with us on the day of the publication of his new book, The Zealot and the Emancipator. And so we are pleased and proud and thankful to have Professor Brands with us virtually from Texas. I presume from Texas, and from Texas, and we are going to spend the next hour discussing Abraham Lincoln and John Brown, or John Brown and Abraham Lincoln. We'll see how that book plays out. While we are having this event, you who are watching us via Facebook Live, so I don't need to explain Facebook to you, but please leave your questions and your comments, nice questions and comments, in our comments section. Now, we're going to interview Daniel Weinberg, and Professor Brands are going to conduct the interview themselves for about an hour. And that about an hour into the program, or at about 4:30 Central Time, I will come back in and we will begin interacting with you and taking your questions. So please feel free to put your questions in the comments during the course of the conversation. We will get to them and try to answer as many of them as we can during the Q&A section from 4:30 until 5. Now, Central Time. Now, the book is The Zealot and the Emancipator. It comes to us from Doubleday Publishers in New York, and we thank them for helping set this program up. And the cost of the book is $30. It is available for order right now, and I'm going to put a link to the order form in the comments in just a second. And Dan, I haven't talked to you about this, so it's a big surprise. Yeah, because Professor Brands was kind enough to sign and date our custom book plate, I am declaring books bought at this event to be a limited edition. Okay. They are a limited edition, limited to the number of books you buy during the course of this program. So that's what you'll get for $30. You'll get H.W. Brands, The Zealot and the Emancipator in first edition. We're going to ask about how many printings this book has gone to already. And then it comes with a signed custom book plate dated on the date of release. Is that enough? Did we cover everything, Daniel?
Yes.
Then let me introduce everybody here on the Abraham Lincoln Bookshop Facebook account to your host for the day, Daniel Weinberg.
Welcome, everybody. Appreciate your being here as always. We do these, as you know, quite a bit, and we've done this since 2005. As Bjorn said, so we appreciate your supporting us and supporting our authors so they can write another book and come back. So today, H.W. Brands, you know him. He holds the Jack S. Blanton Senior Chair in History at the University of Texas at Austin, where he also earned his PhD in 1985. He's written numerous biographies and histories, over 24, on Teddy Roosevelt, Ronald Reagan, Andy Jackson, Grant, Truman, Woodrow Wilson, Aaron Burr, James Fisk. And 2 have been finalists for the Pulitzer, The First American and Traitor to His Class on FDR. His latest book, as you're hearing, is The Zealot and the Emancipator, John Brown, Abraham Lincoln, and the Struggle for Americans' Freedom. It's a Doubleday publication, 445 wonderful pages, readable, nicely illustrated with informative captions, by the way. $30. And as Bjorn said, we have this book plate that actually says signed on book release date. And Bill has been kind enough to not only sign it, but date it. So you will have this as a limited edition as well. Those of you who have already bought prior to this have gotten this, and those of you who can do it today. We'll have more, of course, later on, but just with a signed book plate. So get your orders in today to get this limited. So I'm going to ask you, Bill, a few just quick introductory questions that I just have a need to know. Uh, what books do you read? What you have a degree in mathematics, so do you read on calculus? What do you do for entertainment?
I actually do read on mathematics and science and engineering. When I went to college, I thought I was going to become an engineer, but I got sort of sidetracked first into mathematics and then into history. But I do read that. And quite honestly, in my reading for fun, I don't read history books. Or more precisely, I don't read books by historians. I read sometimes primary sources. So I'll read letters of various people, or I'll read journals of this and that. And I confess that even when I am doing the research for a book, I tend to dive right into the primary sources because I want to meet the characters and I want to get to know them. And most importantly, for my purposes, I need to find their voices. I tend to write in a way that relies on the characters in history to guide me and my readers through the events. And so one of the things that shapes who I write about and what I write about, it has to do with, so did these people leave behind letters or diaries or journals? Can they take me back in time? And then using them, can I take my readers back in time? And this actually has to do with what drew me to history really. And that was the voices and the eyesight, the vision of the actors in history. So
your book shows that because there are many characters, not only Brown and Lincoln, who come into in their own voices, and it really gives a verisimilitude. You are there quality to the book, and it just goes right on because you get into that narrative. Do you think you have a particular writing style? Is it narrative voices? What do you do?
Well, I would say that it is narrative with the lessons that are drawn out, or I won't go so far as to say the arguments that are made, but just made very lightly. So every work of history is a combination of narrative and argument. And in certain works in the academic realm, the argument usually comes first and foremost, and then the narrative is brought in to support the argument. Now, this book, like most of my books lately, are for general readers who don't particularly care about the arguments among the academics. So I want to tell a story. I want to bring my readers in. By the way, I was brought into history. I like the stories. But I also want to drop in here and there, just lightly. So what does this mean? What does this add up to? And so there are themes that come out of the book. There are arguments that are made. But I tend to try to avoid smacking the reader in the face right up front. You listen to the story, and then the lessons will be drawn out of the story.
Yes, exactly it. And I think that's what many readers are looking for. One can go into academia very easily and find those books, but something that's going to bring in the general populace, and boy, do we need the general populace to understand and have knowledge of history and civics. So your books certainly do that. How do you pick your subjects? This one, of course, you have a dual biography here, which is kind of a different approach, but certainly allows, two different approaches to two people solving the same problem.
I have been teaching and writing about American history for 40 years almost. And I make a point, I insist on teaching an introductory course every year to my students. So I get students who have no specialized knowledge of history and no particular interest in history. They're not going to be history majors. But I do try to get them interested in history. But I find this to be a great intellectual exercise for me because I have to keep familiar with the big themes of American history. And so I can't, when I'm teaching this introductory course, for example, I have a 1-hour lecture to cover the Civil War. And so I have to be able to explain things. But as I do this, I think in terms of Well, so with my students, I try to put my students back in history and ask them, what would you have done if you were this person at this point in time? And this is partly because I'm educating young students who are also going to be the citizens of this country. They're going to be responsible, as I explained to them, for the next 50 years of American history. And so it behooves them to find out what people who have gone before have thought about. But I tend to think in terms of what's the big question, or what's the historical task of each generation. So I wrote a book about Benjamin Franklin. I called it The First American. And the argument there was Benjamin Franklin, like others of his generation, George Washington, Thomas Jefferson, they were all born British subjects, but they died American citizens. How did they go from being Englishmen to Americans? How was that switch of identities, or that transformation of identities, carried out? So what brought me to John Brown and Abraham Lincoln was the overriding question of American politics in the mid-19th century. What are we going to do about slavery? But also, it's a deeply moral question that any citizen of a republic has to deal with from time to time. What do we do when our country is going wrong?
Well, you know what? I mean, this is my next thing right here. I said that our time seems to reflect the issues of the mid-19th century. We're still there. So do you bring a perspective to the story, comparing, contrasting? You don't bring in today, and that's not what I want to speak about. But there's certainly, it rhymes, like Mark Twain said.
Well, I do think that there are these enduring, timeless questions. Now, from time to time, they become more timely. But as I say, one of the questions that citizens of a republic have to face is, what do I do when I think my country is engaged in this wrong behavior or something deeply immoral or downright evil? And John Brown and Abraham Lincoln shared the view that slavery was this evil thing. And they had to make a decision. How do I confront this? What do I do? And implicitly, everybody of their generation had to make a decision on the same question, just as we have to make decisions about the issues that confront us. And even just saying, I'm going to have nothing to do with politics. No, if you are a citizen, if you have the right to vote, then there's a responsibility that puts upon you.
Yeah, just being a democracy. That is the
Precisely.
overriding responsibility of everyone, not only to vote, but to be knowledgeable in that voting. And that means oneself learning and going out to find out. Now, look, let's dive into the book. We have a lot of subject to go into. I want to cover numbers of them.
Sure.
So let's kind of get into them. They're going to be kind of brief, but let's go through them. I first want to just quickly, in general, compare Brown and Lincoln, their characters. They both grew up in the wilderness, both lost their mothers early. Lincoln was close to his stepmom. Brown was not. Lincoln was a lenient father. Brown was strict. Lincoln was self-educated. Brown was not, but worked hard. Brown had a religious zeal that Lincoln did not have, at least in the religious side, maybe in the political side. They each had ambition, which is fine. So compare the character briefly of these two.
John Brown was one who saw things more clearly than truth. So he viewed the world in terms of right and wrong. Some of this was informed by his interpretation of the Bible, but some of it was just informed by his experience of life. But once he had made a decision, once he had decided that this is wrong, then he could not stop himself from doing anything he thought he could do to combat that evil. He was utterly the opposite in character from someone who could become a successful political figure in a democracy. Now, John Brown could have been a czar, or he could have been a dictator, but he couldn't have been an effective political leader in a democracy, because that requires that you have to deal with people who differ with you on fundamental views. Abraham Lincoln was ambitious. Abraham Lincoln was intelligent. But Abraham Lincoln also recognized that he did not have a monopoly on truth. Once John Brown came to a conclusion, he was convinced this is right, everything that contradicts this is wrong. Abraham Lincoln was one who asked himself, you know, how is it that other people see things differently than the way I do? And some of this was just, you could call it kind of a moral modesty. He didn't think that he was always right on everything, but also it was something that made him much more effective as a politician in a democracy. Because as right as he might think he was, there were other people who differed. There were other people who differed, and they had a right under our system to their opinions.
Yet he had a moment as well. He had his own red line. He also could become uncompromising, and he did on the idea of nationalization of slavery. Even after he was elected as president-elect, he stopped his own party from moderating that. He said, no, that's what we came together for, and that's what we're going to go forward with. So he could be uncompromising a bit, almost as much as Brown.
Well, you've raised an interesting question, because one of the things that Lincoln greatly feared after the Dred Scott decision of 1857, that said that Congress could not legislate on slavery in the federal territories. More precisely, Congress could not prohibit slavery from the federal territories. Lincoln feared that there might be a Dred Scott II, which would say Congress, or for that matter, even states could not forbid.
I don't know, I don't hear him. Did he go out by chance? There you are.
Yeah, okay. So Lincoln feared that the Supreme Court might rule that Illinois could not prevent slaveholders from bringing their slaves into Illinois, or Massachusetts, or any other state. And he thought that there might actually be, by decree of the Supreme Court, a renationalization of slavery. Now, it's interesting to ask oneself, what would Lincoln have done in that case? I think that Lincoln was sufficiently committed to the Constitution and the rule of law, that he would have said, okay, the Supreme Court has spoken. We have to do this. I mean, we have to do what the Supreme Court said. So I don't think there were any circumstances where Lincoln would follow, for example, the lead of the 11 southern states that seceded and said, no, this has become intolerable. We're going to rip up the Constitution of the United States and write our own. So, but it's an interesting question. Unfortunately for Lincoln, it didn't go that far.
Well, you say that Lincoln's moderation was innate, and some may have said even today that he was slow on the issue of slavery, even though he said that was the issue of the day, and he was going to stop it. But how did he navigate between the pro and anti-slavery factions? He sometimes used inflammatory language. A house divided against itself cannot stand. People found that inflammatory. So, but you say that his moderation could be risky.
Lincoln was very judicious in using polarizing language like his house divided speech. So he never uttered that phrase again. Once was enough. And he did it knowing that he needed to attract attention. If he was going to get any traction in politics, he was trying to inject himself back into politics and make himself a legitimate candidate for the Republican nomination. So he got the attention of the country by saying that. And then he didn't exactly back away from it, but he didn't repeat that phrasing, that particular terminology. So Lincoln pushed, but then he would draw back if he got too close to the brink. And to the charges that were made by people like Frederick Douglass, that Lincoln was too slow on the slavery issue, I think Lincoln was convinced himself, and I think he's right, that if he had gone any faster on the slavery issue, it wouldn't have turned out the way it did.
Because he needed the people. He knew that. And he felt that strongly. That he would lead the people, I think, but at the same time, he needed them. And they had to hear him and follow.
Right.
And had to know that he would.
I may be getting ahead of ourselves a little bit here, but.
We are.
Okay, but when Lincoln issued a call for volunteers after the firing on Fort Sumter, he didn't ask for volunteers to free the slaves.
No.
He asked for volunteers to save the Union. He knew that if he had asked for volunteers to free the slaves, he wouldn't have gotten the volunteers he needed. And
well, he wasn't there for that really, in that he just wanted the stop it from going into the territories. I'm going to get ahead of myself in a question that I have later on, but I may as well do it right now. He felt that if he could keep it in the South where it was and not have it expand, it would eventually die on the vine. Do you believe that? Do you think that it would actually have died on the vine? How long would it take? Would we still be under that? Would there still be house slaves in southern states?
No, there wouldn't be. I think I think that Lincoln shared the view of Henry Clay, that if slavery could be contained, then it would die of its own weight. And I asked my students, I asked my readers to do a thought experiment. So imagine that there wasn't a civil war. Take note that in every country in the world, essentially, in 1800, slavery was legal. And very few people thought it was a moral issue. That's just the way the world was. In 1900, with a handful of exceptions, slavery was legal nowhere. So something changed. There was a change in the way people looked at the world, but more importantly, and this was Henry Clay's view, this was Abraham Lincoln's view, there was a change in the mode of economy of the United States. So northern states did not end slavery within their boundaries out of a fit of morality. It's that slavery no longer paid in Connecticut and Massachusetts and New York. And everybody in the 1780s and 1790s, even the big slaveholders, George Washington, Thomas Jefferson, they believed slavery was a necessary evil. And they expected that it would no longer become necessary, and then one could focus on the evil and do away with it. They were surprised by the expansion of cotton culture. So, but in answer to your first question, yes, if slavery had been contained, it would have died. And the reason it would have died was that the eastern states, Virginia, even the Carolinas to some degree, slavery was no longer profitable there as for growing plantation crops. Slavery in Virginia was profitable because slaves in Virginia could be sold in the West. And it was slaves from Virginia and the Upper South that were sold in Alabama and Mississippi and Arkansas. And that's why slaveholders in places like Virginia were so intent on expanding slavery, because then there would be a market for the slaves that they could sell.
What about the Industrial Revolution? Let's say the cotton went away, but would they not have just trained their slaves to be in industry instead, in manufacturing?
Well, I think not, because slavery is at its heart unskilled labor. And furthermore, it creates a very inflexible labor force. And of course, one of the complaints that slaveholders made in apology for their own system was they would compare it to what they called wage slavery in the North. And they would say when business gets bad in the North, those Northern employers, they simply hard-heartedly lay off their workers. And that's the Industrial Revolution required the ability to lay off workers. You can't lay off slaves. I mean, there were laws actually against it in all of the slave states. So I think at some point, I don't know how long, it might have been another 10 years, by the 1880s, even Brazil ended slavery. And so this is one of the huge questions of American history. And that is, was the Civil War necessary to end slavery? Abraham Lincoln, before the Civil War, thought not. He certainly didn't welcome the war. And he thought, as he said in his House Divided speech, that slavery would end sooner or later. And I think it would have ended because of the modernization implicit in industrialization. But of course, I can't prove that.
Now, of course, the George Robertson letter that he wrote in private in '56, he did backtrack on that and feel, and I think as a son of a psychoanalyst, that he came up with something that was in his mind anyway, and that is, slavery is not going to end without bloodshed. And he felt that at one letter. Now, he didn't go, just like House Divided, he didn't say it again, but it was there in his mind, and he worried about that. And I think maybe that's one of the reasons he was willing to let the war come.
But well, I wouldn't go that far. I would say he wrote that letter against the backdrop of the fighting in Kansas, and blood was being shed in Kansas. And I think that's what he thought. And he might have thought that there was going to be a slave uprising of some sort. I'm pretty sure that Lincoln did not have in mind the Civil War as it developed, the one that killed some 700,000 Americans. That was beyond the imagination of anybody, even John Brown in his bloodiest minded moments.
Now, today's New York Times, I recommend everyone listening to go to the New York Times today, and there's a review of your book by Sean Willens, who has been on this show. And one of the things he said, writes that you said in the book that Lincoln saw a great anti-slavery potential in the Constitution, and that's what grounded him. What did he see? Briefly.
Lincoln believed that the Constitution was embodied in American life and institutionalized the will of the people. And he thought that there was a trend in the direction of recognizing the evils of slavery. And sooner or later, this, call it, well, what Lincoln himself called the better angels of American nature, would come to the fore. And Lincoln believed that if the Union fell apart, then not only would slavery be beyond the reach of an anti-slavery majority in the North, but it would get worse than that. The democracy itself would have failed. And for Lincoln, it's easy for us from the distance of the 21st century to imagine that somehow American democracy was destined to succeed. Well, Lincoln was born early enough that in 1809 and in Lincoln's early years, democracy was still this experiment. And there were lots of people, especially in Europe, who were rooting against the American experiment in democracy.
That sounds like today some of us worry about democracy, and there are people rooting against us as well.
Oh, no question about it. And so with Lincoln, and actually Lincoln is of that sort of second and a half generation of American independence. And they inherited this Republican experiment, but during their lifetimes, it evolved into democracy. And democracy is a far more revolutionary concept than mere republicanism, because republicanism can be ruled by the best, but democracy is ruled by everybody. And all sorts of people said, what do the people know about governing? This is why we have an electoral college, because the framers of the Constitution didn't trust the people to make wise decisions about who the president of the United States should be. So Lincoln realized that democracy was on a knife edge here. And he thought that the Union and democracy were intimately tied together. Because if the Union falls apart, that demonstrates that people cannot govern themselves. He was one of many who thought that, okay, if the South goes away, secession isn't a one-time thing. If the South will secede, and then New England will secede from the rest of the North, and the West will secede, and the whole thing will fall apart. And we'll be back in sort of a warring states era of American history.
So we haven't even gotten to Brown in Kansas, Osawatomie, Harper's Ferry, all of this brilliantly told in your book through the voices of people of the day. And I want to get to some of that, so I am watching the time. But I want to get to one concept that has bothered me for some time now. And I want to ask you about this, because Lincoln and Brown took two separate paths. That's what this dual democracy is about, to do something about the exact same issue. One of those paths was violence. The other one was more moderation, as we're talking about. Well, I grapple with this. In bigger picture, does social change need sometimes a radical, violent spiritism? I think of Menachem Begin and Irgun in the beginnings of Israel. That the usual Zionists did not like what Irgun and the Stern gangs were doing, but did they need them? And I'm wondering the same thing about John Brown. Frederick Douglass, Lincoln, and Brown all thought maybe there'd be violence, but they want to end slavery. But Douglass and Lincoln, as we were saying, took a more moderate, peaceful mean. So was that violent spiritism of John Brown perhaps necessary? Was Lincoln able to use that as a foil as well? Did he take advantage of that? My question to you.
Well, Lincoln did use Brown as a foil, and he took advantage of it. But if the question is, were the actions of John Brown necessary to the emancipation of the slaves? I would say no, because for John Brown to be successful, he required a Lincoln. John Brown's effort to free the slaves failed utterly. And no slaves were freed by the raid on Harper's Ferry. And this because the slaves in the vicinity who were asked to join this uprising against their masters said, forget it. This is suicide. We're not going to do this. What John Brown didn't understand, or maybe he was simply unwilling to acknowledge, was that slavery was going to end not through violence, but through constitutional processes. And he needed Lincoln to make him appear to be a prophet. So John Brown, if the Civil War had never happened, and let's just suppose that slavery ended because the southern slave states decided 15 years later that they'd had enough of slavery and then it would be done, then John Brown would not be remembered the way he's remembered. But John Brown tries to launch this war to free the slaves. It fails, but the war that actually did free the slaves starts up barely a year later. And so John Brown is seen as this prophet. But Abraham Lincoln, so John Brown was helpful to Lincoln in getting Lincoln the nomination of the Republican Party. Because after the John Brown raid, the Republicans were desperate for a nominee that wouldn't scare the daylights out of, voters in the North. The arithmetic of the Electoral College was clear by about 1858. And I say 1858 because Abraham Lincoln challenged Stephen Douglass for the Senate in 1858, but he was paying less attention to who won that Senate seat than who was going to get the Republican nomination 2 years later. So almost any Republican nominee was going to win the general election in 1860. Lincoln had to figure out how to make that him. And he wanted to position himself as a moderate, and it helped that John Brown did this radical thing that caused the frontrunners like William Seward, who was known to be speaking in terms of a higher law than the Constitution. And that really did scare the South, but it also scared people in the North, because in 1860, most people in the North did not want to go to war to free the slaves. They would go to war, as it turned out, to preserve the Union, although I have to say that this is one that I still kind of puzzle over, because most people go to war for something relatively concrete, but the concept of the Union, the Union is this thing. And I would say that I find it in some ways more easier to understand why Southerners enlisted in their own army, because they could say, we're being invaded by this outside force. But for somebody in Massachusetts to respond to Lincoln's call and say, okay, come defend the Union, it was a remarkable thing. And I guess that maybe people were more public-minded than people are today. But I've wondered about this. So what would happen if a state, Texans, they periodically talk about seceding from the Union, or if California seceded, would anybody fight to keep them in today? I don't know the answer to that.
Yeah, many of us, even after all these years and decades in this, wonder, why did the common Union soldier follow Lincoln into battle for life and limb for a Union? It is remarkable. And I think that we should do the same here for the pandemic, frankly. We should follow and think of what they did for their country. We need to do the same. I'm going to ask something a little off here. Each of them were powerful speakers, Brown and Lincoln. Now, Lincoln had the advantage of having his speeches printed and disseminated. What were their styles, individual styles of speaking, and would Brown have been better off if he had disseminated pamphlets, even though that's not his way of doing things?
The two were very effective communicators. with any 19th century president, including Lincoln, it's a little bit hard to gauge how effective they were as speakers, because presidents were called on to speak seldom in those days. I mean, Lincoln gave 3 speeches that anybody pays attention to as president: his first and second inaugural and the Gettysburg Address. But people who attended those gatherings, they hardly heard what he was saying. In the case of the Gettysburg Address, he was finished before most people realized he'd even begun speaking. But Lincoln's speeches read really well, and Lincoln understood what successful communicators in the presidency in the 19th century realized, that their speeches had to read better than they sounded, because in the days before radio, before any kind of broadcast media, the number of people who would hear them speak was minuscule compared to the number who would actually read them. Now, John Brown didn't operate that way. John Brown had to convince people one-on-one. And there are only a few of the speeches of John Brown that are preserved, and those are at his trial. Now, John Brown must have been an extraordinarily magnetic personality. He could win people over who disagreed violently with what he did. So he was no sooner arrested, captured, arrested, put on trial, jailed, and then put on trial in Harper's Ferry, or for the Harper's Ferry raid, then he basically won over the governor of Virginia. He won over members of the Virginia congressional delegation. He won over skeptical, if not downright hostile, onlookers. There was something about Brown. And of course, all we have to go on, all somebody like me has to go on, are the photographs. And then the written descriptions of people who encountered Brown. And so,
in Brown's own words, which you include in this book, which many of us really for the first time are reading.
Yeah. So when Brown was giving a speech, so when he spoke to the court and when he gave what amounted to his final words after being sentenced to death. So he was able to say these things that touched the conscience, the heartstrings of Americans. And he had the great advantage of saying something that pretty much everybody who heard or read about him knew was true, even though many of them were in a position where they wouldn't admit it. And so, it's fairly common to quote John Calhoun from the 1830s saying that slavery was this positive good and impute that view to all Southern slaveholders by the time. I don't think that was true. I think that many of them looked upon the situation in a way not that different from the way Lincoln himself did. So Lincoln repeatedly said that I believe slavery to be wrong, but I don't know how to go about fixing it. I don't know what I would do if I were given all the power in the country. Because to free the slaves at a blow, well, this would raise all sorts of issues that nobody was prepared to deal with at the time. And I would say that the country wasn't prepared to deal with even in Reconstruction and for 100 years after that. So Lincoln recognized that this was a hard problem. John Brown didn't suffer from that kind of ambivalence. And this is one of the things that gave him such a magnetic appeal, such charisma. And so there were reporters sort of all over Kansas and all over the country who, this is John Brown's the big story, so they're going to go out and find John Brown. And many of them get drawn into Brown's band. He's sort of a cult leader. And
who were his followers? Who were the ones that really came in?
It started from the fact that there were 5 or more of his adult sons who were involved. And boy, they had a conflicted relationship with their father because he was their father and they were raised to believe that they should obey their father. But by now they were adults. But they did buy into the evils of slavery. But they were in time appalled, some of them, at the lengths to which Brown would go. And it was one thing when he was simply assisting in the operations of the Underground Railroad. And when he was helping to educate and work alongside free blacks in upstate New York on a farm at North Elba. But when it came to going to Kansas and committing some of the most brutal murders in that bloody place, then it really gave pause. And a couple of the sons, they wondered what they had gotten themselves into, but they couldn't bring themselves to say, no, this is not the right way to go.
Well, who were his financiers? He had to have money, and there were a couple of large ones, of course.
So
Garrett Smith and
there was a
Sanford.
group of New England and New York philanthropists, anti-slavery philanthropists.
Well, I'm going to ask you this before you go on. Here is a pamphlet that we have from 1856, a GoFundMe page, getting monies for Friends for Kansas, which I showed you, and they put Lincoln's name in here, which he didn't want, didn't know about it, and was very unhappy about that. But did the National Committee from the Friends of Kansas, did they also help throw that into the mix with the other two?
Right. So the Kansas-Nebraska Act of 1854 blew up the Missouri Compromise. The Missouri Compromise had said in the lands that are part of the Louisiana Purchase, the northern part is going to be free of slavery forever. The southern part might be open to slavery. It was assumed that it would be. But the Kansas-Nebraska Act repealed that part of the Missouri Compromise. And so all of a sudden, Kansas is open to slavery. Now, this was Stephen Douglas's idea, and Stephen Douglas had this notion that it was going to allow him to bridge the growing divide between North and South in the Democratic Party. And he might find his way into the White House as a result. There was also the idea that there needed to be a transcontinental railroad or a Pacific railroad. And it should be built, it was going to have to be built through these territories, and it would be much safer to build through the territories, which meant that investors would be willing to put up money to build the railroad if they had organized governments. Oh, yes. And the eastern terminus of the railroad would be Chicago. So this would be great for Illinois. This would be great for Chicago. It would probably be great for Stephen Douglas. And he came up with a formula that sounds really good on paper. And the formula was popular sovereignty. And it's basically let the people decide. So instead of Congress telling slaveholders ahead of time, you cannot take your slaves into Kansas territory, what Douglas says is, let free settlers go in, let pro-slavery settlers go in, taking their slaves if they like, and then when enough people have landed in Kansas territory to make it a state, they will write a constitution, and if the people who are there, a majority, want slavery in Kansas, then they'll write a pro-slave constitution. If a majority say no slavery in Kansas, then they'll write an anti-slavery constitution. Douglas said, that's what we do in Illinois, that's what we do in Ohio, that's what we do in the other states. Why should Kansas be any different? Well, what this did was to invite radicals on both sides. So the radical abolitionists in the North and the radical pro-slavery forces in the South to engage in a contest, first of all, a race to see who got there first. Because if you got most of your people there, then when the time came to write the Constitution.
That's what this pamphlet was doing, funding.
Exactly, exactly. And the slavery.
Anti-slavery.
Right, the pro-slavery side had the advantage that to get to Kansas, you had to go to Missouri, which was a slave state. And so there was right there. And the strongest element of the anti-slavery movement was in New England, and they were far away. And so what they did is they didn't all go. Now some did. John Brown went. He went from upstate New York to Kansas, along with his sons.
They moved to Chicago here.
Yes.
This is where their headquarters were. They got closer.
Exactly. But what they would do is they would put up money. And so John Brown had a group of 6, and they were sometimes called the Secret Six, because these were people who, especially after John Brown was wanted for murder, for the murder of the 5 pro-slavery settlers on Pottawatomie Creek, they didn't want to get too close to Brown. Interestingly, they knew Brown was wanted for the murder, but they never asked him point blank, did you do it? Because they didn't want to know. And they were willing to put their money on the line, but they weren't willing to put their lives on the line. And there was a bit of John Brown, to some degree, shamed them into supporting him because, I mean, he could say to people like Henry Thoreau or Ralph Waldo Emerson, boy, if you were really serious about being opposed to slavery, you would join me in Kansas. Well, they're not going to go do that, but they might give money to the cause. And so Brown had this source of income. And Brown was really good at charming people and making people believe that he was on the right track. He knew when not to speak. In fact, the words that he did speak gained power from all the things that he didn't say. He was known as, a strong silent type. And so people could read into Brown's comments, in many cases, what they wanted to hear.
Let me ask you a question from left field. And this is with hindsight, because Stephen Douglas didn't know Civil War was coming any more than anyone else did. But when he blew up the Compromise of 1850 to try to get to the presidency, did that open the gates to a real possibility?
I'm sorry,
for Civil
you've
War
frozen
versus
at your end.
hindsight? What do you think? Was that a peg to do that?
I lost you when you started. Stephen Douglas didn't.
Well, Stephen Douglas didn't any more than anyone else did that Civil War was going to come. But when he blew up the Compromise of 1850, to get but to get to the presidency, from hindsight, today, do you think that was one of the actual pegs that brought Civil War on, among many others, that he actually did help bring that to fruition?
There are 4 or 5 things that happen in the 1850s that contribute to the deepening of the sectional divide. I'll start with the Compromise of 1850, which includes the Fugitive Slave Act. And the Fugitive Slave Act outraged people in the North because it made ordinary people complicit with slave catchers. So there was that. There was the Kansas-Nebraska Act. But I should add that Stephen Douglas was partly responsible for the passage of the Compromise of 1850. Then the Kansas-Nebraska Act, that was Stephen Douglas's brainchild. And that blew up the Missouri Compromise and created the issue that brought Abraham Lincoln back into politics. And then there was Bleeding Kansas, the guerrilla war that took place following the Kansas-Nebraska Act, and then the Dred Scott decision of 1857, and then the Harper's Ferry raid. You could probably imagine a world in which 1 or maybe 2 of those didn't happen, and you'd still wind up at the same place. But if you took out 3 or 4 of them, then American history might have looked very different.
Yeah. I'm going to ask you, we have about 12, 13 minutes left, and I have 2.5 hours of questions left. So one, I just want to ask, here is Frederick Douglass, and this is an autograph he gave. It was a big time for autograph collecting, and this is one in our stock right now. What did Douglass and other contemporaries broadly feel about John Brown before Harper's Ferry, even after Potawatomi, for instance?
The first thing I want to share my appreciation for Frederick Douglass as a literary device, and leave aside, his contributions to history. But I needed a character in my book to be the go-between between John Brown and Abraham Lincoln, to carry the story forward. And I needed also someone who could look on both of those from the outside, because I've got a lot of John Brown from the inside, his letters and the recollected speeches, words that he spoke. And I got Abraham Lincoln, of course. He's on the record for all sorts of things. But I needed somebody, a contemporary, who could look at the two. And because John Brown's going one way and Abraham Lincoln's going the other way, and what about Frederick Douglass? So Frederick Douglass met John Brown in the 1840s. So fairly early in John Brown's career as an abolitionist. And Frederick Douglass had the credibility that came from having been a slave. And there was something about Douglass. Douglass had a charisma of his own. And he this charisma or something, there was a connection that was made between John Brown and Frederick Douglass that caused Brown to explain to Douglass in greater detail what his plans were for freeing the slaves. Now,
They met numbers of times.
oh, yes, yes. And every time John Brown went east to raise money, he would always stop in Rochester and talk with Douglass if he were home, or meet him somewhere else if he weren't. But also, from John Brown's standpoint, if he could get Frederick Douglass on board with what he was doing, then that would give enormous credibility to what he was doing. Because there was a tendency on the part of, well, politicians like Abraham Lincoln to dismiss John Brown and those others at the radical wing of the abolitionist movement and say, I don't have anything to do with that. Frederick Douglass was a person who could not lightly be dismissed because aside from being an escaped former slave himself, he was also a very powerful speaker and an arresting presence. And so there's a critical moment, I don't want to spoil the story, but there's a critical moment when John Brown tries to talk Frederick Douglass into joining him in the Harper's Ferry raid. And it's wonderful because Frederick Douglass recounts the story and talks about how they meet in this out-of-the-way place and Brown comes in disguise and he just tries to get pleased with Brown to come along because John Brown knows that the weak link in his Harper's Ferry strategy is persuading slaves that they need to come aboard, that they should join this uprising, that they should accept the weapons that he has toted to Harper's Ferry to hand to all of these enslaved men, young men, who are going to join his army. And if Frederick Douglass was there, then they could look and say, okay, here's a former slave. He thinks this Brown has a good idea. But Douglass wouldn't do it. And Douglass recognized that this was a very dangerous, perhaps a suicidal effort. And furthermore, Douglass recognized that his own gifts were in speaking and in writing. They were not in fighting.
There are so many things we have not gotten to here. The House of Gileadites, for instance, that's early in your book with
Yes.
Brown. Read the book and you'll know. The Battle of the Potawatomi and Potawatomi, the Creek, those are influential moments in Brown's life and in our country as well. But we've got to get to Harper's Ferry before we end here today and go on to questions. If I asked you to explain that madness, we'll be here for 2 days. But certainly it was. And during and after that raid, it brought so many people there that are well known to us. Robert E. Lee, Jeb Stuart, Henry Wise, as you mentioned, Clement Vallandigham, John Wilkes Booth, for heaven's sakes, James Mason. And many of them, as you said, spoke with admiration of him after they heard him at the trial. And you'll hear that in this book when you read it. There's so many outside people that you hear here. Charles Dana, 2 years before the mast. An Englishman, Gladstone, that talks about what he saw in Kansas. Who saw it in Washington, D.C. Very colorful Washington, D.C. was, and there's a great description of that here. But let's take Harper's Ferry. I want to ask who Osborne Anderson was, because you use his Voice from Harper's Ferry. Is that a book, pamphlet? Where did that come from? And who was he? He was a black follower of Brown. He got away. How did he get away, and what happened to him? Briefly.
Okay, so he was a free black who was a follower of John Brown, and he was persuaded by Brown that this was something worth doing. It's a little bit unclear why he didn't end up in the engine house with John Brown, but there were members, so Brown gathered about 24 of his followers, and most of them went into Harper's Ferry, but a few of them went into the surrounding area to try to drum up support on the plantations around. And Osborne Anderson was one of those. And so when he saw sort of what had happened, then he decided, okay, maybe I'm not going to go down with this ship. But he's an interesting character because, well, he tells his story. And needless to say, John Brown didn't tell his story about Harper's Ferry after the fact. He's one of the few survivors of Harper's Ferry who lives to tell his tale. Now, in reaction to what you said about all these famous figures who find their way to Harper's Ferry or coming, it's a reminder, it's one of the charms, actually, of simply for someone who writes history from this period. American society was much smaller then than now. And you see this, of course, in accounts of the Civil War, where the officers on the Union side, the senior officers on the Union side, knew all of the senior officers on the Confederate side, because they were all members of the same classes at West Point. And of course, everybody who was a high official in the civil government of the Confederacy had been, most of them had been officials in the Union government. And so it really was a war between, a war of families, a war of friends. And yes, it is interesting that the person who comes to basically capture John Brown and to quash rebellion is, well, it's natural that Lincoln and the War Department would choose the most promising officer in the Union Army at the time, the United States Army, and that was Robert E. Lee. And he did exactly what you would expect of him. He wasted no time, just ordered the assault and arrest him, and that's that.
It's a great story that you give in detail, but it flows. It's not bogged down. Anyone who reads that Harper's Ferry chapters is going to enjoy that immensely. There was a great-grandnephew of George Washington there, Lewis Washington. Interesting. And his sword was taken, a presentation sword to Washington. George Washington was in that house and was taken by Brown. Now, we're into relics here at the Abraham Lincoln Bookshop. Where is that relic today? Is it on display anywhere? Are there any other relics that are in museums from there?
But I don't. I don't know the answer to where that sword is. But one of the reasons that I developed that story the way I did is that I wanted to tip my hand to readers to the effect that I'm relying on participants' accounts of what happened. And so I tell two versions of the story of how Lewis Washington gave up the sword. And one is from Washington himself, and Lewis Washington himself talks about how he stood up to these intruders. And he said, "You may take it from me, but I will never hand it over to you. I will yield to force majeure." But then Osborne Anderson, in fact, he tells another version where Lewis Washington is cowering. And it's a reminder, and I do it sort of gently because I really don't get into adjudicating between different accounts, but it's a reminder to readers that we historians, we writers of history and consumers of history, we are basically at the mercy of our sources. And the human memory is selective and sometimes simply fails. So I'd say, okay, this is the way one person told the story, this is the way another person told a story. And I didn't quite put it this way, but essentially, and now you, dear reader, you choose.
Now you put these together, and we're bludgeoning our viewers with this, but if you look at the footnotes are quick, brief quotes, sometimes longer quotes. That's what they are. You're not going into other books to go to, other places to go to, secondary sources. No. Every one of these footnotes is a quote, and you weave those together, I think, in a wonderful way that really works. I want to ask you one other quick question here at the end before we give it over to our viewership, before I've asked half my questions, by the way. In Lincoln's second inaugural, Frederick Douglass might have thought that Lincoln was channeling John Brown when he spoke the words, "Every drop of blood drawn by the lash shall be paid by another drawn by the sword." Was he?
So this is where Lincoln chooses his words very carefully. What he said there, and what you quoted was right, but what he said, "It may be that so-and-so." He's not yet willing to say, "It must be that." It may be that. Essentially, that every drop of blood that was brought out by the slave's lash must be repaid by a drop of blood drawn by the sword. And so what Lincoln is essentially embracing with little room for wiggling, is what John Brown said in the last words that are attributed to him. And this is the note that he handed to his jailer on the way to the gallows. And he said that I'm convinced that the crimes of this country must be purged by blood. And what Lincoln is talking about is, in effect, blood atonement. So the evil of slavery is so great that the only way that the country can be rid of this curse is to pay back that evil, drop of blood for drop of blood. Now, it's very interesting to watch what you could call the moral evolution of Lincoln in the course of the war, because before the war began, Lincoln does not talk about religion a lot. And it's a little bit hard to figure out what his religious views are. He was not a devout churchgoer. He grew up reading the Bible, but it seems that the Bible was as much a source of literary inspiration to the young Lincoln as it was religious or moral inspiration. But as he felt the weight of the war coming down on his shoulders, as the casualty lists mounted, so that by the time he gave his second inaugural address, 500,000, 600,000 people had died as a result of decisions that Lincoln had made. Now, he never wavered, and he never thought, gee, I shouldn't have done that. But he did realize there was this tremendous cost. And I think it was perhaps emotionally, psychologically necessary for Lincoln to say, you know, God must have had a hand in this, because I can't bear the responsibility all by myself. And it's a perfectly understandable position for somebody to take. And of course, for people of religious views, I mean, that's exactly the position he should have taken. But it's a position that Lincoln came to during the course of the war. And a lot of people thought that Lincoln became a deeper soul in the course of the war. And you know, it'd be surprising if he didn't. But it's one of those things. And then, of course, Lincoln is assassinated by John Wilkes Booth, who did attend the execution of John Brown and considered John Brown to be the great man of his age and a role model. When Lincoln is assassinated, then he joins John Brown in martyrdom to the cause of the ending of slavery.
Yet he eschewed the idea of, he knew he'd be hanged, but he eschewed the idea of doing what Brown did and give a final speech to the ages. And he instead let himself be shot.
Which is really surprising in some ways, because
He was so theatrical. I'm surprised too.
he could have memorized his lines, you know, but he didn't. So, yeah.
All right, now Bjorn will tell you we have a half an hour. If you want to get a limited edition of this book, the only one is going to come from Abraham Lincoln Bookshop with this wonderful book plate that we have signed and dated today now. So Bjorn, I'm sure we have, I hope we have some comments and questions for Bill.
Oh, we do. And thank you very much for the wonderful conversation for the last hour. And Dan, you are free to participate in the audience questions, but please
I have one.
let them get something. And so, yeah, we have to
start one out.
We have a few questions from the audience, and while Professor Brands answers them, I'm going to continue to monitor. But before we go into that, I'm going to remind everybody that they can order the Zealot and the Emancipator at our website. There's a link there. The cost is $30, and we will ship it out to you. Today is the date of release. We couldn't have shipped them yesterday. It would have been against the rules. But if you're with us today on Facebook, it's the same as being at that big book event on the release date, where the author is there at the table, and you get in line and you have a chance to ask a question. And so here we go.
And we think, by the way, we thank Doubleday very much for, and you, Bill, for allowing us to have that honor.
Doubleday Publishing Company and the publicist for this book, Elena Hershey, who did an enormous amount of wonderful work to get us here. First question is from Samuel Black in Dayton, Ohio. So that's John Brown country, close to John Brown country at one point. Samuel wants to know, did, did today's political polarization inspire or impact the writing of this book?
It did not. The short answer is it did not. And this because I started work on this book. Well, I get a question very often, so how long did it take you to write a book? And I have two answers to the question. As I mentioned earlier, I've been teaching American history since the late 1970s. So I have been talking to my students about John Brown and about Abraham Lincoln. You know, these are big figures in American history. So I've been thinking about them. I've been thinking about the subject. I made this my principal project about 3.5 years ago. And so, yes, I was sort of aware of things that emerged in all that time. But by the time that the recent protests, the recent movement, the current chapter began, the book was already to bed. But I will say this, that one of the ways I introduced this question at the beginning, I mentioned it earlier, that in a republic, people have to decide what they will do when they think that government policy is misguided or just downright wrong. What are you going to do? And every generation has to deal with that in some form or another. And this is what we are wrestling with now. What do individuals do? And people will have different views on what the most efficient, the most pragmatic, the most effective course is. There are people sort of, I'm not going to say the equivalent of John Brown because thank God, you know, nobody has launched an attack like Harper's Ferry, but there are people who think that if you are right, then being right gives you license to do stuff you wouldn't ordinarily do. And John Brown took that to an extreme. As I say, thankfully, we haven't seen that extreme today. And then there are others who say, no, we need to work through the system. That's the way you will make lasting change. So there is a pull in the direction of John Brown. There's a pull in the direction of Abraham Lincoln. And so I think it's useful, I hope it's useful to readers to see how this played out at an earlier time. And again, I will say that we're not on the brink of a civil war, and I certainly hope we don't come to that. And so I'm not going to say that the stakes were higher back in the days of John Brown and Abraham Lincoln, but the crisis seemed to be deeper. And the crisis seemed to be more immediate than it seems to most people today. Thank heavens. And I hope that it doesn't get that deep and immediate.
Okay, thank you for that. We're going to move on to a question from Brian Steenbergen, who is a friend of Abraham Lincoln Bookshop in Michigan, and we're always happy to see Brian with us. Greetings. Brian asks, Professor Brands, he puts up quotes here, you have avoided writing about Lincoln for a long time. Why now, and why pair him with Brown instead of confronting him directly?
Well, the short answer to that is that there is so much written on Abraham Lincoln by so many very astute, insightful, excellent historians and biographers that I really had to ask myself, so what can I do that's a little bit different? But there's another reason that is sort of more personal to me. I did write a series of biographies, fairly fat books, on 6 figures in American history. That they were, long ago, I had this idea that I was going to write a multi-volume history of the United States. And I couldn't persuade a publisher that this would be a good idea. So I bootlegged the idea into a series of biographies. And I didn't tell my publisher what I was doing. These were going to add up to a history of the United States. But I chose to write about 6 individuals. Benjamin, and I'll just tell you the order that they finally played out. But Benjamin Franklin, Andrew Jackson, Ulysses Grant, Theodore Roosevelt, Franklin Roosevelt, Ronald Reagan. And so I had been writing these big biographies for a while. And I thought, okay, I want to take a break from biography. And I wanted to do this partly because I just wanted another way of looking at things. But also, and this is meant with no disrespect in the slightest toward biographers, and I consider myself a biographer still, but there is something that happens when you write a biography. It is almost unavoidable. And I tried hard to avoid it, making sure that my biographies were life and times, with the times included a lot. But given the nature of the genre, it is almost impossible to avoid giving the impression that the world revolves around your subject. Well, the world doesn't revolve around anybody, as important as that person might be. So what I wanted to see, I wanted to take a look at important individuals, but I wanted to look at particular aspects of what they did, but I also wanted to sort of get outside that self-contained world of the biography. So with John Brown and Abraham Lincoln, I get to see what amounts to a critique of Lincoln and people like Lincoln, but not so much. John Brown didn't critique Abraham Lincoln directly, but the choice of approach he took to slavery basically was a searing critique of Lincoln and all those pragmatists. So I tried to get at these crucial issues, these crucial decisions, and I try to find important, sincere people on both sides of the issue. A few years ago, I wrote a book about Douglas MacArthur and Harry Truman and the constitutional crisis they created in the middle of the Korean War. And I thought that to do justice to this question, I had to argue the case and basically to show as much as I could about both of these figures. They're both important people, Truman and MacArthur. Both of them considered themselves patriots. There was an argument to be made for the position of both of them. And then in that book, as in the book about John Brown, I don't step in at the end. I make a point of not stepping in at the end and saying, well, MacArthur was wrong and Truman was right, or vice versa, or John Brown was wrong and Lincoln was right, or vice versa. I try to convey these two viewpoints as honestly and fully as I can, and then let readers draw their own conclusion. And the reason for this is, in my long reading and observation of history, disputes in history, disputes over important historical questions, almost never hinge on you've got the wrong information. So John Brown and Abraham Lincoln were working with the same information, but they brought to the decision they had to make different sets of values. And so I wrote about Franklin Roosevelt. People still argue about Franklin Roosevelt, but the argument is not based on the condition of the United States in the 1930s. It's not even based on what the New Deal was trying to do. It's based on whether you think the government should be larger or smaller. And I can't tell readers that they should have a particular set of values. No, they bring to the reading their own values, but I want to give them enough information. I want to give them enough ammunition to make their own decision.
Let me ask you though, do you, as an historian, don't you also in the back of your mind have a point of view? Do you ever want to reveal that point of view, maybe in supplemental essays?
To be honest, Dan, I'm not going to say no exactly. I'd say as a historian, the answer is no. As a teacher, the answer is no. Now, as a citizen and as a voter, I have to make a decision. So I go to the ballot box and I cast my vote one way or the other. But as a historian, I find that it is more important. I can do, I hope, more important, more valuable work by being true to the story than by being true to a particular cause. And it's for the reasons that I laid out, that I don't want to make people's minds up for them. I want to give them the information for which they can make up their own minds based on their own view, their own set of values.
Well, then let me ask you one question before we go back, Bjorn, to all of our viewers. And that is, how do you assess the newsroom today that has a plethora of talking historical heads who are very good, and there they are. And I don't know if they remain objective or not when they give their versions of history in a news program. I said to Doris Kearns-Goodwin last time, has the newsroom become the new classroom? Because we're not teaching humanities anymore. That's going by the wayside, except for you, it seems. And so what do you think about those in the newsroom, the historians that are there?
In the first place, every historian, just like every individual, makes choices for himself and herself. And they decide, you want to go on TV or not? And I have the greatest respect for my historical colleagues who show up in these newsrooms. But it's something that I have essentially stopped doing because I discovered that depending on which network you're appearing on, you are basically pigeonholed. And this became very clear when I was invited some years ago. This is back when Bill O'Reilly still had a show. And I was invited to go on the show, and they wanted to do a pre-interview. And everybody does this. They just say, okay, this is what we're going to be talking about. And we'd kind of like to have an idea of what you might be saying, so we'll know how to position you. Well, in this case, the assistant producer, whoever it was so bold to say, and this is what we want you to say. And at that point, I said, forget it. But it became, and I'm not picking on Fox News because I had a similar experience working with MSNBC. I mean, it wasn't quite so clear cut, but because I am a history professor in a college of liberal arts at a university, it was assumed that I would take a particular view. And when I didn't, it turned out that, well, okay, we don't know what to do with this guy. We won't invite him back. But there was one last thing. And this actually was on CNN. And I think CNN is a bit more down the middle than either Fox and MSNBC. But I agreed to go on the coverage of Barack Obama's second inauguration. So I was sitting up there on my high chair in this heated tent, but the back of the tent was open, so you could see the Capitol behind us. And on inauguration day, the temperature was 10 degrees or something like this, so we're all bundled up. And we were sitting in a line, and so the conversation started. And I was waiting my turn until I realized, wait, that's not the way this works. You have to basically interject. You've got to talk over somebody in order to get your voice heard at all. Right. And I decided this is not, again, with no disrespect to my colleagues who do this, and some of them do it very well, but it just didn't suit me. So I don't do much of this anymore.
Okay. All right.
I overspoke you at times.
Well, I'm going to jump in again on behalf of some of the guest questions, but Bill Shepard, another friend of the shop from the Abraham Lincoln Bookshop Association, Bill asked, was this book in part inspired by your previous book, Heirs and Founders, where you told us about Clay, Calhoun, Webster, and the problems with slavery that they faced?
It was, yes. And so this book, Heirs of the Founders, deals with, well, it's called Heirs of the Founders because it's the second generation of American leaders. After the founding generation steps off the stage, then on come Henry Clay, Daniel Webster, John Calhoun, and that age. But they leave the stage by death, actually, all of them in the early 1850s. And so at the end of that book, it's clear that the country is on a path that is leading someplace not very promising. So I had to pick up the story from there. And by choosing John Brown and Abraham Lincoln, it's very convenient because they kind of step right in. Lincoln started in politics earlier, but he's out of politics when Henry Clay dies in 1852. But it's partly the death of Henry Clay, for whom Abraham Lincoln gives a wonderful eulogy, saying that he was my beau ideal of a statesman. And Lincoln, in some respects, sees himself as the heir of Henry Clay. And in my formulation, Henry Clay was the heir of the founders, so Lincoln is the heir of the heir. And John Brown really steps onto the stage in a forceful way during the 1850s. So yes, it was, I won't call it exactly a sequel, but it dealt with the central question that the three that I wrote about in Heirs of the Founders kind of brought to the fore. When that story began, slavery was one issue among several. And in fact, during the early part of their careers, it didn't really rise to the top. And there was discussion of secession over war powers, the possible secession by New England in the War of 1812. And South Carolina threatened secession over taxes, the tariff, in the early 1830s. But gradually, the issues at dispute came to focus on slavery. And so that's where I decided, okay, how am I going to deal with slavery? And by looking at John Brown and Abraham Lincoln, this is the issue that they grappled with. This is the central issue of their period on the center stage of American politics.
Yet John Brown didn't give one iota of thought to being an heir to the founders, did he?
No. In fact, John Brown didn't have much of a constitutional theory, but the abolitionists that he hung out with did. And by the 1840s and 1850s, people like William Lloyd Garrison, they thought that the Constitution was this pact with the devil. And even the Declaration of Independence, they were willing to sneer at. It's a striking thing to know that people like William Lloyd Garrison were talking about northern secession from the South, long before the South seceded in 1860 and 1861, which is an interesting comment on the attitude of many abolitionists. Now, I would say most of them were sincere. I would say probably all of them were sincere, but they often didn't think through what exactly it was that they were endorsing. Because if the North seceded from the South, yes, it would allow people like Garrison to be able to wash their hands of slavery. They would no longer feel responsible for it. But it would do absolutely no good for any slaves. And so there's a bit of this, and this is something that people like first Henry Clay and then Abraham Lincoln, they held against the abolitionists, because the abolitionists seemed to, it was more important for them to be right than for them to be effective. And Lincoln understood that the abolitionists were not going to free the slaves. And with the number of slaves that were freed by the Underground Railroad and its equivalents was not small. And for anyone who gained freedom that way, it was a big deal. But if you add up all of those people, that was next to nothing compared to what general emancipation would be all about. And this is why, so Thomas Jefferson and then Henry Clay were two individuals who were in positions that it's really hard for modern people to get their heads around. And Jefferson kind of suffers from this. He was opposed to slavery. He was an emancipationist, but he was also a slaveholder. And for most people, the obvious thing is, well, if you're opposed to slavery, why don't you at least start by getting rid of your slaves? And in Jefferson's case, he owned his slaves, many of the slaves for much of his adult life, the way that most people own their own home, which is actually the bank owns the home and they just carry the note on it. And so Jefferson's slaves were collateral for all of his debts. But beyond that, Jefferson knew, Henry Clay knew, George Washington knew that if they emancipated their slaves while they were alive, George Washington, Jefferson, Henry Clay freed his slaves after his death, that they would lose all of their credibility in opposing slavery because they would simply become another abolitionist. They had to have a stake in the outcome of this. And Jefferson said that he would gladly pay the cost of giving up all of his slaves if it would lead to general emancipation. Right. So it's kind of a reminder, and Lincoln was in that, Lincoln never owned slaves, of course, but he understood that you had to be in the political game to have any real effect. That slavery would end not through the actions of people like John Brown, but by amending the Constitution, that's how it finally happened.
Well, I do want to jump in with some more questions from the customers while we still have some time. But from what you said there, I want to leap to the question of John Brown. And Matt Knopfsinger is asking us, well, first, Matt has a comment on Bjorn, why aren't you moderating Dan? But he's calling me a Chris Wallace, basically, for not moderating Dan enough. But thanks, Matt. But Matt, here's Matt's question, because I want to get this in. And it's a good question. And it brings Brown back into the conversation. Do we love, hate John Brown? Both. If you advocate for him, do you advocate for what we are condemning today as riots?
So, yeah, John Brown is a hard person to figure out how to think about, because I think nearly everybody today would agree that he was on the right side of history. And he got there sooner than a lot of people. I'm not sure that he got there sooner than Lincoln, because Lincoln was as opposed to slavery in his own way as Brown was. So if you think that slavery was wrong, and nearly everybody does by today, then you can't help but admiring that part of John Brown that said slavery is wrong, slavery is evil, and I have to strike out against it. So there's that part of Brown that one cannot help admiring. But on the other hand, Brown committed acts that there's no way somebody should countenance today, hauling these 5 pro-slavery settlers out of their warm beds, out of their cabins on Potawatomi Creek, and massacring them with broadswords, hacking them to pieces as a political statement. It's a loaded word, but if this were in any other cause, the word that would come immediately to mind is John Brown is a terrorist. And so one has to deal with that. And what was John Brown advocating in attacking Harper's Ferry? Now, to give John Brown full credit, he was not trying to start an uprising of slaves like that which has ended slavery in Haiti, where thousands and thousands of people were killed. The way he explained it to himself was he would help the slaves escape. And when Southern slave holders discovered that their property in slaves was not secure, then the price of slaves would go down. And when the price of slaves went down, slavery would no longer be profitable. Now, that's putting the most charitable gloss on John Brown's plan. But the fact that he ordered to be made these 1,000 pikes that were going to be handed out to the slaves to use for them to fight for their freedom, well, he had to know these would be used against the whites who would try to prevent the slaves from getting their freedom. And he was willing to risk a race war in the mountains of Virginia that might spread throughout the South. And he absolved himself of responsibility for this by saying this was God's will. And extremists, and Brown, I call him a zealot, but you certainly could call him an extremist, who believe that they have divine sanction for what they do, they can take even a very worthy cause and carry it too far. So one has to be careful. And no one, I don't think any responsible person, certainly in our fraught moment, would say John Brown's a good model for the way that we ought to deal with the problems facing us. I mean, that would be incendiary. And I think it would be counterproductive.
Well, we have a couple of other questions, but the clock really is running out on us. So instead of asking Professor Brands to respond to the questions right now, I am going to thank those who asked them and give you a sense of what they wanted to ask. Dave Bradley does ask about, brings in the US-Mexico War, the Mexican War, and wonders if the cataclysmic events of the 1850s were inevitable given the ball starting to roll with the acquisition of the territory from the US-Mexico War. And also Dave Wiegers has asked about Lincoln's motivations for traveling to Kansas. And indeed, we probably, if we wanted to spend a lot more time together, we could talk about Lincoln and Kansas because why was he there as well? So I thank Dave, and I thank Dave Bradley and Dave Wiegers for asking those questions. I'm also going to thank George Hook for joining us again. George joined us last time in the Gary Gallagher Show and really livened things up with commentary, not necessarily directing questions, but keeping the commentary lively. And George Hook is the only one that has brought up what might otherwise be an elephant in the room, and I wanted to ask about it. Last night, Showtime premiered the first episode of the miniseries, The Good Lord Bird, from the James McBride novel. And so I'm going to ask my question about The Good Lord Bird. And it's not, is it realistic? Because I think James McBride, the novelist, would probably tell you, don't talk about it that way. I don't know whether you've read the novel or whether you saw it last night, Professor Brands, but can you comment on the Brown that comes out in The Good Lord Bird. And even if you haven't seen the show, I just trust that it's the same as John Stewart Curry's painting in the Kansas State Capitol, entitled, the Tragic Prelude. He is absolutely out of his mind. But whatever you might know about it, can you comment on, here's a great opportunity. Your book comes out the day after a major miniseries introducing a version of John Brown to the nation.
So I have not seen the show,
Hmm.
nor have I read the book. Now, the reason I haven't read the book, the reason I haven't seen the show is I don't get Showtime. But the reason that I didn't read the book is that when I'm embarking on a project, I assiduously avoid reading anything fictional about that project, because I have a fairly sticky mind that I remember things that I read, but I do not always remember where I read them. And so if I'm reading a work of fiction on John Brown, I might remember a detail, but not remember that it was actually created by James McBride rather than by some historical source. But I will say this, John Brown was not insane. John Brown was not crazy. John Brown was committed. John Brown was zealous. John Brown took his views to an extreme. But no, he didn't have a suicide wish, for example. Some people might say that's what drove him to Harper's Ferry. No, he hoped that that would succeed. No, John Brown was, I think, exceedingly rational. If you started with John Brown's premises, that slavery is evil and that God commands us to combat evil, then it's hard to avoid the position that John Brown got himself into. It's harder to explain, in some ways, somebody like Abraham Lincoln. So if you really think this is evil, then why aren't you out there on the front lines? Now, Lincoln did have his explanation, but those explanations are often unsatisfactory for people who want action now, who want to see the world in black and white. But politics, successful politics, operates in the gray area of pragmatism, of compromise. And that is something that a lot of people are uncomfortable with, especially on moral issues.
All right, well, thank you once again, H.W. Brands, for joining us to talk about The Zealot and the Emancipator. We've already talked about how to order the book a couple of times, so I'm not going to waste your time here at the end. Daniel, do you have anything to share with us before we head out?
Bill, thank you. I appreciate it. And all of you who watched. Matt, I'll zip up next time a little bit earlier. And thank all the viewers and those who are supporting us by purchasing this book on the day of release. Thank you for that.
All right, thank you very much. Thank you, Professor Brands. And I'm going to end the live video with thanks to everybody who joined us today. I'm Bjorn Skaptison with Daniel Weinberg and H.W. Brands. This has been A House Divided.